The offshore oil and gas industry is potentially a hazardous place to work in. The statistics show that compared to many other onshore industries, it's actually a very safe business. That safety record has been achieved by a lot of hard work. Work represented by the better design of plant and equipment, the implementation of safe systems of work, hazard and risk assessments, incident reporting systems, toolbox talks, and so on. At heart, it means making people aware of how their behaviour influences the final safety result, then making sure they have the right tools and systems to do the job safely. It's also come about because the workforce is now aware of the benefits of a workplace culture where safety is of equal importance to commercial, technical, and other considerations. No incidents or injuries is now the accepted rule, and that means that we have to personally accept all accidents and all occupational injuries and illnesses as being avoidable. Working at sea on ships, barges, drilling rigs or other vessels has extra hazards because the workplace is moving around, sometimes quite violently. So something that would be a trivial matter onshore, like using hand tools, carrying items or simply going through a door, can become a hazardous business. So we have to be constantly aware of hazards and risks and must work towards avoiding accidents. One of our most useful tools in doing this is the risk assessment. A risk assessment can be a formal written document, or it can be done informally at a toolbox meeting before a job starts. Either way, it provides the discipline of planning and preparing a job properly. Let's just define a couple of terms: hazard and risk. A hazard is a situation with the potential to cause harm to people, the environment, equipment, or property. Offshore hazards could be posed by many things. For example, electricity, flammable substances, moving machinery, lifting operations, noise, fumes, working at height, working in an enclosed space, and many more. Risk is a measure of the likelihood of an incident, an event that might cause actual harm or loss to people, plant, the environment, or even the job itself. It's important to assess the degree of risk: high, medium or low. In other words, the probability that an incident will happen. Another important factor is the consequence associated with the risk. How much harm could be caused by an incident? Risk assessment is all about awareness of events, taking responsibility for planned actions and job preparations. It means knowing the steps that make up a task, identifying all the potential risks involved, and then managing and controlling the risks in an appropriate and safe way. It's an essential part of any job. In fact, in many countries, it's a statutory requirement. There are a number of basic steps. The first is to look for and identify the hazards that apply to the job. There is a well-established hierarchy of hazards that runs from dangers to people and processes, through dangers to equipment and materials, and hazards that might affect the environment. This is followed by deciding who might be harmed, evaluating the risks and consequences, and then working to control the risks. There are two ways of doing this. The first is to try to make an incident less likely, to prevent it from happening. This is called risk reduction. For example, using personal fall arrest equipment will prevent falls from a height. That's risk reduction. The second is to make the consequences of an incident less severe if something does happen. This is called risk mitigation. For example, wearing a life jacket if you're working over the side won't stop an incident happening, but it might save your life if you fall into the sea. That's risk mitigation. We can't remove all risk. The goal has to be to make all risks as low as is practically and reasonably possible. It's important to make sure that everyone understands the job in hand and not to rush or to overcomplicate things. That can lead to people cutting corners and taking shortcuts. Dangerous situations can also arise when a number of different hazards combine. For example, if an item of equipment fails at the start of a shift in fine weather, then people will probably handle things safely. The same equipment failure happening to tired people coming to the end of their shift, perhaps in rough weather, becomes a different matter and could easily go wrong. Incidents are nearly always the result of a combination of hazards or a breakdown of safeguards. Formal risk assessments can be done well in advance of a job, but it's very important with this form of risk assessment to make sure that everything is recorded in writing. That means the hazards you have identified, the discussions that you've had, and the controls you've put in place. It's at the toolbox talk that the risk assessment document will be discussed, updated and extended as necessary. But don't just regard this as a paper exercise. Risk assessment won't work unless it's relevant to the job and, most importantly, seen as being relevant by you, by the people doing the job. It's a tool for you to use to do a job safely. And assessments must be reviewed regularly and revised if necessary. Your risk assessment should keep pace with changes in the real world, and remember, the actions in a risk assessment must be appropriate to the level of risk involved. In our industry, the big jobs are almost always very safe. Because they're big, the consequences of an accident are probably significant, so a lot of people are involved in risk assessments. Everyone knows what to do and how to do it, and there are plenty of people looking out for each other. It's in the smaller jobs that problems can arise, jobs that people have done hundreds of times. That's when it becomes tempting to cut corners, to take a shortcut past a barrier, to not bother to go back to the store to get the right tool, to lift something that's too heavy rather than go to get help or to get a mechanical aid. This is where the toolbox talk comes in, to remind people about the risks of routine jobs, to keep them on their toes, aware of what they're doing and the hazards involved. And toolbox talks, like risk assessments, should be something to which everyone can contribute and feel involved with. Particular problems can arise when a job doesn't turn out as you'd expect or as you'd planned. If something has changed, it might be something as simple as the weather getting worse. Then don't push on and hope for the best. That can be very dangerous. Take time out to think things through. Manage the change. Don't let it manage you. If necessary, start a fresh risk assessment. Pause to take advice if you need it, and then, and only then, carry on, maybe using different equipment, an extra level of PPE, or whatever the new circumstances need. And don't forget that although you may be very familiar with the jobs you do and with the workplace, new people, visitors, contractors and so on won't be, so you'll need to include them in your risk assessment. Make sure they're familiar with the assessment, that they know what's happening, and keep them out of the way if they're not directly involved. Remember, people can get hurt anywhere, in the galley, in the control room or on the bridge, as well as out on the deck. You should assume that everywhere has its hazards, so for all jobs there should be some form of risk assessment. It's only the most routine tasks that may not need a formal written risk assessment. Recognising hazards and carrying out risk assessments are things that everyone must feel involved with and contribute to. An assessment won't be effective unless everyone has an input into it and feels able to talk openly about the possible risks and the proposed actions to deal with the risks. So far we've been talking about risk assessments as team-based efforts, and of course they are, but it's vital that you as an individual appreciate that you personally are the last step in the process, the last barrier to preventing an incident. To help you, there's a personal risk assessment tool known as Last Minute Risk Assessment. It's very simple, common sense really, but it gives you and perhaps your workmates that extra measure of safety to avoid incidents, and it applies both at work and off the job. It really comes down to being aware of what's going on around you, aware of what you've got to do, aware of what precautions you need to take, and making sure that you understand the task at hand and that you're competent and properly equipped to do it. And once you've started a job, if you're ever in any doubt about the way the job is going, if you're not comfortable about what's happening, then stop. Talk things through with your workmates and your supervisor, do another risk assessment if necessary, but make sure you're completely satisfied about safety before you start again. Risk assessments are an essential part of your safety culture, keeping you and your workmates safe, and most importantly, getting you home safe.
Risk assessment is a very simple but very important process. Please use this DVD to improve your risk assessments. The more we use risk assessment, the better we will get at controlling the hazards, and the less likely the consequences of injury to people, damage to equipment or the environment. I worked for 13 years on vessels and have seen the hazards and the consequences. I worked at a time when risk assessment was not the systematic technique we needed to be. I am certain good risk assessment could have prevented many of these incidents. An essential part of risk assessment is communication. Risk assessment can improve the communication between supervisor and team and with other people. We should never underestimate the importance of communicating the task, its hazards and the way we're going to control them. Use risk assessment whenever you undertake a task at work. Of course, risk assessment should not stop at the workplace. We can use the same risk assessment techniques whenever we undertake a task. If you take one thing away from this, it should be poor risk assessment can affect many people. We owe it to ourselves, our colleagues, and our families to get our risk assessments right.